Welcome to Long Stories for Sleep. Just set me playing, relax, and drift off. Subscribe and you'll have a library of stories to choose from. Comment to let me know where in the world you are and what stories you would like added. That's really helpful information. Enough rambling. On with the story.
The Life of Horatio, Lord Nelson by Robert Southey. Part 1, 1758 to 1783. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Chapter 1. 1758 to 1783. Nelson's birth and boyhood. He is entered on board the Reasonable, goes to the West Indies in a merchant ship, then serves in the Triumph. He sails in Captain Phipps's voyage of discovery, goes to the East Indies in the Seahorse, and returns in ill health. Serves as acting lieutenant in the Worcester, and is made lieutenant into the Lowestoft, commander into the Badger brig, and post into the Hinchinbroke expedition against the Spanish main, sent to the North Seas in the Albemarle services. During the American War, Horatio, son of Edmund and Catherine Nelson, was born September 29, 1758, in the parsonage house of Burnham Thorpe, a village in the county of Norfolk, of which his father was rector. His mother was a daughter of Dr. Suckling, prebendary of Westminster, whose grandmother was sister of Sir Robert Walpole, and this child was named after his godfather, the first Lord Walpole. Mrs. Nelson died in 1767, leaving 8 out of 11 children. Her brother, Captain Maurice Suckling, of the Navy, visited the widower upon this event, and promised to take care of one of the boys. 3 years afterwards, when Horatio was only 12 years of age, being at home during the Christmas holidays, he read in the county newspaper that his uncle was appointed to the Raisonnable, of 64 guns. "Do, William," said he to a brother who was a year and a half older than himself, "write to my father, and tell him that I should like to go to sea with Uncle Maurice." Mr. Nelson was then at Bath, whither he had gone for the recovery of his health. His circumstances were straitened, and he had no prospect of ever seeing them bettered. He knew that it was the wish of providing for himself by which Horatio was chiefly actuated, and did not oppose his resolution. He understood also the boy's character, and had always said, that in whatever station he might be placed, he would climb if possible to the very top of the tree. Captain Suckling was written to. "What," said he in his answer, "has poor Horatio done, who is so weak, that he, above all the rest, should be sent to rough it out at sea? But let him come, and the first time we go into action, a cannonball may knock off his head, and provide for him at once." It is manifest from these words that Horatio was not the boy whom his uncle would have chosen to bring up in his own profession. He was never of a strong body, and the ague, which at that time was one of the most common diseases in England, had greatly reduced his strength. Yet he had already given proofs of that resolute heart and nobleness of mind which, during his whole career of labor and of glory, so eminently distinguished him. When a mere child, he strayed a bird's nesting from his grandmother's house in company with a cowboy. The dinner hour elapsed, he was absent, and could not be found, and the alarm of the family became very great, for they apprehended that he might have been carried off by gypsies. At length, after search had been made for him in various directions, he was discovered alone, sitting composedly by the side of a brook which he could not get over. "I wonder, child," said the old lady when she saw him, "that hunger and fear did not drive you home." "Fear? Grandmamma," replied the future hero, "I never saw fear. What is it?" Once, after the winter holidays, when he and his brother William had set off on horseback to return to school, they came back, because there had been a fall of snow, and William, who did not much like the journey, said it was too deep for them to venture on. "If that be the case," said the father, "you certainly shall not go, but make another attempt, and I will leave it to your honor. If the road is dangerous you may return, but remember, boys, I leave it to your honor." The snow was deep enough to have afforded them a reasonable excuse, but Horatio was not to be prevailed upon to turn back. "We must go on," said he. "Remember, brother, it was left to our honor." There were some fine pears growing in the schoolmaster's garden, which the boys regarded as lawful booty, and in the highest degree tempting, but the boldest among them were afraid to venture for the prize. Horatio volunteered upon this service. He was lowered down at night from the bedroom window by some sheets, plundered the tree, was drawn up with the pears, and then distributed them among his schoolfellows without reserving any for himself. He only took them, he said, because every other boy was afraid. Early on a cold and dark spring morning Mr. Nelson's servant arrived at this school, at North Walsham, with the expected summons for Horatio to join his ship. The parting from his brother William, who had been for so many years his playmate and bedfellow, was a painful effort, and was the beginning of those privations which are the sailor's lot through life. He accompanied his father to London. The Raisonnable was lying in the Medway. He was put into the Chatham stage, and on its arrival was set down with the rest of the passengers, and left to find his way on board as he could. After wandering about in the cold, without being able to reach the ship, an officer observed the forlorn appearance of the boy, questioned him, and happening to be acquainted with his uncle, took him home and gave him some refreshments. When he got on board, Captain Suckling was not in the ship, nor had any person been apprised of the boy's coming. He paced the deck the whole remainder of the day without being noticed by anyone, and it was not till the second day that somebody, as he expressed it, took compassion on him. The pain which is felt when we are first transplanted from our native soil when the living branch is cut from the parent tree is one of the most poignant which we have to endure through life. There are after griefs which wound more deeply, which leave behind them scars never to be effaced, which bruise the spirit, and sometimes break the heart, but never do we feel so keenly the want of love, the necessity of being loved, and the sense of utter desertion, as when we first leave the haven of home, and are, as it were, pushed off upon the stream of life. Added to these feelings, the sea-boy has to endure physical hardships, and the privation of every comfort, even of sleep. Nelson had a feeble body and an affectionate heart, and he remembered through life his first days of wretchedness in the service. The Raisonnable, having been commissioned on account of the dispute respecting the Falkland Islands, was paid off as soon as the difference with the court of Spain was accommodated, and Captain Suckling was removed to the Triumph, 74, then stationed as a guardship in the Thames. This was considered as too inactive a life for a boy, and Nelson was therefore sent a voyage to the West Indies in a merchant ship, commanded by Mr. John Rathbone, an excellent seaman, who had served as master's mate under Captain Suckling in the Dreadnought. He returned a practical seaman, but with a hatred of the King's service, and a saying then common among the sailors after the most honour, "Forward the better man." Rathbone had probably been disappointed and disgusted in the navy, and, with no unfriendly intentions, warned Nelson against a profession which he himself had found hopeless. His uncle received him on board the Triumph on his return, and discovering his dislike to the navy, took the best means of reconciling him to it. He held it out as a reward that, if he attended well to his navigation, he should go in the cutter and decked longboat, which was attached to the commanding officer's ship at Chatham. Thus he became a good pilot for vessels of that description from Chatham to the Tower, and down the Swin Channel to the North Foreland, and acquired a confidence among rocks and sands of which he often felt the value. Nelson had not been many months on board the Triumph, when his love of enterprise was excited by hearing that 2 ships were fitting out for a voyage of discovery towards the North Pole. In consequence of the difficulties which were expected on such a service, these vessels were to take out effective men instead of the usual number of boys. This, however, did not deter him from soliciting to be received, and, by his uncle's interest, he was admitted as coxswain under Captain Lutwidge, second in command. The voyage was undertaken in compliance with an application from the Royal Society. The Honourable Captain Constantine John Phipps, eldest son of Lord Mulgrave, volunteered his services. The Racehorse and Carcass bombs were selected as the strongest ships, and, therefore, best adapted for such a voyage, and they were taken into dock and strengthened, to render them as secure as possible against the ice. 2 masters of Greenland men were employed as pilots for each ship. No expedition was ever more carefully fitted out, and the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Sandwich, with a laudable solicitude, went on board himself, before their departure, to see that everything had been completed to the wish of the officers. The ships were provided with a simple and excellent apparatus for distilling fresh from salt water, the invention of Dr. Irving, who accompanied the expedition. It consisted merely in fitting a tube to the ship's kettle, and applying a wet mop to the surface as the vapor was passing. By these means, from 34 to 40 gallons were produced every day. They sailed from the Nore on the 4th of June. On the 6th of July they were in latitude 79° 56 minutes and 39 seconds, longitude 9° 43 minutes and 30 seconds E. The next day, about the place where most of the old discoverers had been stopped, the racehorse was beset with ice, but they hove her through with ice anchors. Captain Phipps continued ranging along the ice, northward and westward, till the 24th, he then tried to the eastward. On the 30th he was in latitude 80° 13 m, longitude 18° 48 me among the islands and in the ice, with no appearance of an opening for the ships. The weather was exceedingly fine, mild, and unusually clear. Here they were becalmed in a large bay, with 3 apparent openings between the islands which formed it, but everywhere, as far as they could see, surrounded with ice. There was not a breath of air, the water was perfectly smooth, the ice covered with snow, low and even, except a few broken pieces near the edge, and the pools of water in the middle of the ice fields just crusted over with young ice. On the next day the ice closed upon them, and no opening was to be seen anywhere, except a hole, or lake as it might be called, of about 1.5 miles in circumference, where the ships lay fast to the ice with their ice anchors. From these ice fields they filled their casks with water, which was very pure and soft. The men were playing on the ice all day, but the Greenland pilots, who were further than they had ever been before, and considered that the season was far advancing, were alarmed at being thus beset. The next day there was not the smallest opening, the ships were within less than 2 lengths of each other, separated by ice, and neither having room to turn. The ice, which the day before had been flat and almost level with the water's edge, was now in many places forced higher than the mainyard by the pieces squeezing together. A day of thick fog followed, it was succeeded by clear weather, but the passage by which the ships had entered from the westward was closed, and no open water was in sight, either in that or any other quarter. By the pilot's advice the men were set to cut a passage, and warp through the small openings to the westward. They sawed through pieces of ice 12 feet thick, and this labor continued the whole day, during which their utmost efforts did not move the ships above 300 yards, while they were driven, together with the ice, far to the N and E by the current. Sometimes a field of several acres square would be lifted up between 2 larger islands, and incorporated with them, and thus these larger pieces continued to grow by aggregation. Another day passed, and there seemed no probability of getting the ships out without a strong E or NE wind. The season was far advanced, and every hour lessened the chance of extricating themselves. Young as he was, Nelson was appointed to command one of the boats which were sent out to explore a passage into the open water. It was the means of saving a boat belonging to the racehorse from a singular but imminent danger. Some of the officers had fired at and wounded a walrus. As no other animal has so human-like an expression in its countenance, so also is there none that seems to possess more of the passions of humanity. The wounded animal dived immediately, and brought up a number of its companions, and they all joined in an attack upon the boat. They wrested an oar from one of the men, and it was with the utmost difficulty that the crew could prevent them from staving or upsetting her, till the carcass's boat came up, and the walruses, finding their enemies thus reinforced, dispersed. Young Nelson exposed himself in a more daring manner. One night, during the midwatch, he stole from the ship with one of his comrades, taking advantage of a rising fog, and set off over the ice in pursuit of a bear. It was not long before they were missed. The fog thickened, and Captain Lutwidge and his officers became exceedingly alarmed for their safety. Between 3 and 4 in the morning the weather cleared, and the 2 adventurers were seen, at a considerable distance from the ship, attacking a huge bear. The signal for them to return was immediately made. Nelson's comrade called upon him to obey it, but in vain. His musket had flashed in the pan, their ammunition was expended, and a chasm in the ice, which divided him from the bear, probably preserved his life. "Never mind," he cried, "do but let me get a blow at this devil with the butt end of my musket, and we shall have him." Captain Lutwidge, however, seeing his danger, fired a gun, which had the desired effect of frightening the beast, and the boy then returned, somewhat afraid of the consequences of his trespass. The captain reprimanded him sternly for conduct so unworthy of the office which he filled, and desired to know what motive he could have for hunting a bear. "Sir," said he, pouting his lip, as he was wont to do when agitated, "I wished to kill the bear, that I might carry the skin to my father." A party were now sent to an island, about 12 miles off, named Walden's Island in the charts, from the midshipman who was entrusted with this service, to see where the open water lay. They came back with information that the ice, though close all about them, was open to the westward, round the point by which they came in. They said also, that upon the island they had had a fresh east wind. This intelligence considerably abated the hopes of the crew, for where they lay it had been almost calm, and their main dependence had been upon the effect of an easterly wind in clearing the bay. There was but one alternative, either to wait the event of the weather upon the ships, or to betake themselves to the boats. The likelihood that it might be necessary to sacrifice the ships had been foreseen. The boats accordingly were adapted, both in number and size, to transport, in case of emergency, the whole crew, and there were Dutch whalers upon the coast, in which they could all be conveyed to Europe. As for wintering where they were, that dreadful experiment had been already tried too often. No time was to be lost. The ships had driven into shoal water, having but 14 fathoms. Should they, or the ice to which they were fast, take the ground, they must inevitably be lost, and at this time they were driving fast toward some rocks on the Ene. Captain Phipps sent for the officers of both ships, and told them his intention of preparing the boats for going away. They were immediately hoisted out, and the fitting begun. Canvas breadbags were made, in case it should be necessary suddenly to desert the vessels, and men were sent with the lead and line to N and E, to sound wherever they found cracks in the ice, that they might have notice before the ice took the ground, for in that case the ships must instantly have been crushed or overset. On the 7th of August they began to haul the boats over the ice, Nelson having command of a 4-oared cutter. The men behaved excellently well, like true British seamen. They seemed reconciled to the thought of leaving the ships, and had full confidence in their officers. About noon, the ice appeared rather more open near the vessels, and as the wind was easterly, though there was but little of it, the sails were set, and they got about a mile to the westward. They moved very slowly, and were not now nearly so far to the westward as when they were first beset. However, all sail was kept upon them, to force them through whenever the ice slacked the least. Whatever exertions were made, it could not be possible to get the boats to the water's edge before the 14th, and if the situation of the ships should not alter by that time, it would not be justifiable to stay longer by them. The commander therefore resolved to carry on both attempts together, moving the boats constantly, and taking every opportunity of getting the ships through. A party was sent out next day to the westward to examine the state of the ice. They returned with tidings that it was very heavy and close, consisting chiefly of large fields. The ships, however, moved something, and the ice itself was drifting westward. There was a thick fog, so that it was impossible to ascertain what advantage had been gained. It continued on the 9th, but the ships were moved a little through some very small openings. The mist cleared off in the afternoon, and it was then perceived that they had driven much more than could have been expected to the westward, and that the ice itself had driven still further. In the course of the day they got past the boats, and took them on board again. On the morrow the wind sprang up to the NNE. All sail was set, and the ships forced their way through a great deal of very heavy ice. They frequently struck, and with such force that one stroke broke the shank of the racehorse's best bower anchor, but the vessels made way, and by noon they had cleared the ice and were out at sea. The next day they anchored in Smeerenburg Harbor, close to that island of which the westernmost point is called Hakluyt's Headland, in honor of the great promoter and compiler of our English voyages of discovery. Here they remained a few days, that the men might rest after their fatigue. No insect was to be seen in this dreary country, nor any species of reptile, not even the common earthworm. Large bodies of ice, called icebergs, filled up the valleys between high mountains, so dark as, when contrasted with the snow, to appear black. The color of the ice was a lively light green. Opposite to the place where they fixed their observatory was one of these icebergs, above 300 feet high. Its side toward the sea was nearly perpendicular, and a stream of water issued from it. Large pieces frequently broke off and rolled down into the sea. There was no thunder nor lightning during the whole time they were in these latitudes. The sky was generally loaded with hard white clouds, from which it was never entirely free even in the clearest weather. They always knew when they were approaching the ice long before they saw it, by a bright appearance near the horizon, which the Greenland men called the blink of the ice. The season was now so far advanced that nothing more could have been attempted, if indeed anything had been left untried, but the summer had been unusually favorable, and they had carefully surveyed the wall of ice, extending for more than 20 degrees between the latitudes of 80°D and 81°D, without the smallest appearance of any opening. The ships were paid off shortly after their return to England, and Nelson was then placed by his uncle with Captain Farmer, in the Seahorse, of 20 guns, then going out to the East Indies in the squadron under Sir Edward Hughes. He was stationed in the foretop at watch and watch. His good conduct attracted the attention of the master, afterwards Captain Surridge, in whose watch he was, and upon his recommendation the captain rated him as midshipman. At this time his countenance was florid, and his appearance rather stout and athletic, but when he had been about 18 months in India, he felt the effects of that climate, so perilous to European constitutions. The disease baffled all power of medicine, he was reduced almost to a skeleton, the use of his limbs was for some time entirely lost, and the only hope that remained was from a voyage home. Accordingly he was brought home by Captain Piggott, in the Dolphin, and had it not been for the attentive and careful kindness of that officer on the way, Nelson would never have lived to reach his native shores. He had formed an acquaintance with Sir Charles Pole, Sir Thomas Trubridge, and other distinguished officers. Then, like himself, beginning their career, he had left them pursuing that career in full enjoyment of health and hope, and was returning, from a country in which all things were to him new and interesting, with a body broken down by sickness, and spirits which had sunk with his strength. Long afterwards, when the name of Nelson was known as widely as that of England itself, he spoke of the feelings which he at this time endured. "I felt impressed," said he, "with a feeling that I should never rise in my profession. My mind was staggered with a view of the difficulties I had to surmount and the little interest I possessed. I could discover no means of reaching the object of my ambition. After a long and gloomy reverie, in which I almost wished myself overboard, a sudden glow of patriotism was kindled within me, and presented my king and country as my patron. Well then, I exclaimed, I will be a hero. And, confiding in Providence, I will brave every danger." Long afterwards Nelson loved to speak of the feelings of that moment, and from that time, he often said, a radiant orb was suspended in his mind's eye, which urged him onward to renown. The state of mind in which these feelings began, is what the mystics mean by their season of darkness and desertion. If the animal spirits fail, they represent it as an actual temptation. The enthusiasm of Nelson's nature had taken a different direction, but its essence was the same. He knew to what the previous state of dejection was to be attributed, that an enfeebled body, and a mind depressed, had cast this shade over his soul, but he always seemed willing to believe that the sunshine which succeeded bore with it a prophetic glory, and that the light which led him on was light from heaven. His interest, however, was far better than he imagined. During his absence, Captain Suckling had been made controller of the navy. His health had materially improved upon the voyage, and as soon as the Dolphin was paid off, he was appointed acting lieutenant in the Worcester, 64, Captain Mark Robinson, then going out with convoy to Gibraltar. Soon after his return, on the 8th of April, 1777, he passed his examination for a lieutenancy. Captain Suckling sat at the head of the board, and when the examination had ended, in a manner highly honourable to Nelson, rose from his seat, and introduced him to the examining captains as his nephew. They expressed their wonder that he had not informed them of this relationship before. He replied that he did not wish the younker to be favoured, he knew his nephew would pass a good examination, and he had not been deceived. The next day Nelson received his commission as second lieutenant of the Lowestoft frigate, Captain William Locker, then fitting out for Jamaica. American and French privateers, under American colours, were at that time harassing our trade in the West Indies. Even a frigate was not sufficiently active for Nelson, and he repeatedly got appointed to the command of one of the LOW's tenders. During one of their cruises the Lowestoft captured an American letter of marque. It was blowing a gale, and a heavy sea running. The first lieutenant, being ordered to board the prize, went below to put on his hanger. It happened to be mislaid, and while he was seeking it, Captain Locker came on deck. Perceiving the boat still alongside, and in danger every moment of being swamped, and being extremely anxious that the privateer should be instantly taken in charge, because he feared that it would otherwise founder, he exclaimed, "Have I no officer in the ship who can board the prize?" Nelson did not offer himself immediately, waiting, with his usual sense of propriety, for the first lieutenant's return, but hearing the master volunteer, he jumped into the boat, saying, "It is my turn now, and if I come back, it is yours." The American, who had carried a heavy press of sail in hope of escaping, was so completely waterlogged that the LOW's boat went in on deck and out again with the sea. About this time he lost his uncle. Captain Locker, however, who had perceived the excellent qualities of Nelson, and formed a friendship for him which continued during his life, recommended him warmly to Sir Peter Parker, then Commander-in-Chief upon that station. In consequence of this recommendation he was removed into the Bristol flagship, and Lieutenant Cuthbert Collingwood succeeded him in the Lowestoft. Sir Peter Parker was the friend of both, and thus it happened that whenever Nelson got a step in rank, Collingwood succeeded him. The former soon became first lieutenant, and on the 8th of December, 1778 was appointed commander of the Badger brig, Collingwood taking his place in the Bristol. While the Badger was lying in Montego Bay, Jamaica, the Glasgow of 20 guns came in and anchored there, and in 2 hours was in flames, the steward having set fire to her while stealing rum out of the afterhold. Her crew were leaping into the water, when Nelson came up in his boats, made them throw their powder overboard and point their guns upward, and by his presence of mind and personal exertions prevented the loss of life which would otherwise have ensued. On the 11th of June, 1779 he was made post into the Edinburgh Quay, of 28 guns, an enemy's merchantman, sheathed with wood, which had been taken into the service. Collingwood was then made commander into the Badger. A short time after he left the Lowestoft, that ship, with a small squadron, stormed the fort of St. Fernando de Romoa, on the south side of the Bay of Honduras, and captured some register ships which were lying under its guns. 250 quintals of quicksilver and 3 millions of piastres were the reward of this enterprise, and it is characteristic of Nelson that the chance by which he missed a share in such a prize is never mentioned in any of his letters, nor is it likely that it ever excited even a momentary feeling of vexation. Nelson was fortunate in possessing good interest at the time when it could be most serviceable to him. His promotion had been almost as rapid as it could be, and before he had attained the age of 21 he had gained that rank which brought all the honours of the service within his reach. No opportunity, indeed, had yet been given him of distinguishing himself, but he was thoroughly master of his profession, and his zeal and ability were acknowledged wherever he was known. Count d'Estering, with a fleet of 125 sail, men of war and transports, and a reputed force of 25,000 men, threatened Jamaica from Street Domingo. Nelson offered his services to the Admiral and to Governor-General Dalling, and was appointed to command the batteries of Fort Charles, at Port Royal. Not more than 7,000 men could be mustered for the defense of the island, a number wholly inadequate to resist the force which threatened them. Of this Nelson was so well aware, that when he wrote to his friends in England, he told them they must not be surprised to hear of his learning to speak French. D'Estering, however, was either not aware of his own superiority, or not equal to the command with which he was entrusted. He attempted nothing with his formidable armament, and General Dalling was thus left to execute a project which he had formed against the Spanish colonies. This project was, to take Fort San Juan on the river of that name, which flows from Lake Nicaragua into the Atlantic, make himself master of the lake itself, and of the cities of Granada and Leon, and thus cut off the communication of the Spaniards between their northern and southern possessions in America. Here it is that a canal between the two seas may most easily be formed, a work more important in its consequences than any which has ever yet been effected by human power. Lord George Germain, at that time Secretary of State for the American Department, approved the plan, and as discontents at that time were known to prevail in the Nuevo Reino, in Popayan, and in Peru, the more sanguine part of the English began to dream of acquiring an empire in one part of America, more extensive than that which they were on the point of losing in another. General Dalling's plans were well formed, but the history and the nature of the country had not been studied as accurately as its geography. The difficulties which occurred in fitting out the expedition delayed it till the season was too far advanced, and the men were thus sent to adventure themselves, not so much against an enemy, whom they would have beaten, as against a climate which would do the enemy's work. Early in the year 1780, 500 men destined for this service were convoyed by Nelson from Port Royal to Cape Gracias a Dios, in Honduras. Not a native was to be seen when they landed. They had been taught that the English came with no other intent than that of enslaving them, and sending them to Jamaica. After a while, however, one of them ventured down, confiding in his knowledge of one of the party, and by his means the neighboring tribes were conciliated with presents, and brought in. The troops were encamped on a swampy and unwholesome plain, where they were joined by a party of the 79th Regiment from Black River, who were already in a deplorable state of sickness. Having remained here a month, they proceeded, anchoring frequently, along the Mosquito shore, to collect their Indian allies, who were to furnish proper boats for the river, and to accompany them. They reached the river San Juan, March 24, and here, according to his orders, Nelson's services were to terminate, but not a man in the expedition had ever been up the river, or knew the distance of any fortification from its mouth, and he, not being one who would turn back when so much was to be done, resolved to carry the soldiers up. About 200, therefore, were embarked in the Mosquito shore craft and in two of the HMBOK's boats, and they began their voyage. It was the latter end of the dry season, the worst time for such an expedition. The river was consequently low. Indians were sent forward through narrow channels between shoals and sandbanks, and the men were frequently obliged to quit the boats and exert their utmost strength to drag or thrust them along. This labor continued for several days. When they came into deeper water, they had then currents and rapids to contend with, which would have been insurmountable but for the skill of the Indians in such difficulties. The brunt of the labor was borne by them and by the sailors, men never accustomed to stand aloof when any exertion of strength or hardihood is required. The soldiers, less accustomed to rely upon themselves, were of little use. But all equally endured the violent heat of the sun, rendered more intense by being reflected from the white shoals, while the high woods, on both sides of the river, were frequently so close as to prevent any refreshing circulation of air, and during the night all were equally exposed to the heavy and unwholesome dews. On the 9th of April they reached an island in the river, called San Bartolomeo, which the Spaniards had fortified, as an outpost, with a small semicircular battery, mounting 9 or 10 swivels, and manned with 16 or 18 men. It commanded the river in a rapid and difficult part of the navigation. Nelson, at the head of a few of his seamen, leaped upon the beach. The ground upon which he sprung was so muddy that he had some difficulty in extricating himself, and lost his shoes. Barefooted, however, he advanced, and, in his own phrase, boarded the battery. In this resolute attempt he was bravely supported by Despard, at that time a captain in the army, afterward unhappily executed for his schemes of revolutionary treason. The castle of St. Juan is situated about 16 miles higher up. The stores and ammunition, however, were landed a few miles below the castle, and the men had to march through woods almost impassable. One of the men was bitten under the eye by a snake which darted upon him from the bough of a tree. He was unable to proceed from the violence of the pain, and when, after a short while, some of his comrades were sent back to assist him, he was dead, and the body already putrid. Nelson himself narrowly escaped a similar fate. He had ordered his hammock to be slung under some trees, being excessively fatigued, and was sleeping, when a manituri lizard passed across his face. The Indians happily observed the reptile, and knowing what it indicated, awoke him. He started up, and found one of the deadliest serpents of the country coiled up at his feet. He suffered from poison of another kind, for drinking at a spring in which some boughs of the manchineel had been thrown. The effects were so severe as, in the opinion of some of his friends, to inflict a lasting injury upon his constitution. The castle of San Juan is 32 miles below the point where the river issues from the Lake of Nicaragua, and 69 from its mouth. Boats reach the sea from thence in a day and a half, but their navigation back, even when unladen, is the labor of 9 days. The English appeared before it on the 11th, 2 days after they had taken San Bartolomeo. Nelson's advice was that it should instantly be carried by assault, but Nelson was not the commander, and it was thought proper to observe all the formalities of a siege. 10 days were wasted before this could be commenced. It was a work more of fatigue than of danger, but fatigue was more to be dreaded than the enemy. The rains set in, and could the garrison have held out a little longer, diseases would have rid them of their invaders. Even the Indians sunk under it, the victims of unusual exertion, and of their own excesses. The place surrendered on the 24th. But victory procured to the conquerors none of that relief which had been expected. The castle was worse than a prison, and it contained nothing which could contribute to the recovery of the sick, or the preservation of those who were yet unaffected. The huts which served for hospitals were surrounded with filth, and with the putrefying hides of slaughtered cattle almost sufficient of themselves to have engendered pestilence, and when at last orders were given to erect a convenient hospital, the contagion had become so general that there were none who could work at it, for besides the few who were able to perform garrison duty, there were not orderly men enough to assist the sick. Added to these evils, there was the want of all needful remedies, for though the expedition had been amply provided with hospital stores, river craft enough had not been procured for transporting the requisite baggage, and when much was to be left behind, provision for sickness was that which of all things men in health would be most ready to leave. Now, when these medicines were required, the river was swollen, and so turbulent that its upward navigation was almost impracticable. At length even the task of burying the dead was more than the living could perform, and the bodies were tossed into the stream, or left for beasts of prey, and for the gallinazos, those dreadful carrion birds, which do not always wait for death before they begin their work. 5 months the English persisted in what may be called this war against nature. They then left a few men, who seemed proof against the climate, to retain the castle till the Spaniards should choose to retake it and make them prisoners. The rest abandoned their baleful conquest. 1,800 men were sent to different posts upon this wretched expedition, not more than 380 ever returned. The HMBOK's complement consisted of 200 men, 87 took to their beds in one night, and of the whole crew not more than 10 survived. The transport's men all died, and some of the ships, having none left to take care of them, sunk in the harbour. But transport ships were not wanted, for the troops which they had brought were no more. They had fallen, not by the hand of an enemy, but by the deadly influence of the climate. Nelson himself was saved by a timely removal. In a few days after the commencement of the siege he was seized with the prevailing dysentery. Meantime Captain Glover, son of the author of Leonidas, died, and Nelson was appointed to succeed him in the Janus, of 44 guns, Collingwood being then made post into the Edinburgh Quay. He returned to the harbour the day before San Juan surrendered, and immediately sailed for Jamaica in the sloop which brought the news of his appointment. He was, however, so greatly reduced by the disorder, that when they reached Port Royal he was carried ashore in his cot, and finding himself, after a partial amendment, unable to retain the command of his new ship, he was compelled to ask leave to return to England, as the only means of recovery. Captain, afterwards Admiral, Cornwallis took him home in the Lion, and to his fare and kindness Nelson believed himself indebted for his life. He went immediately to Bath, in a miserable state, so helpless that he was carried to and from his bed, and the act of moving him produced the most violent pain. In 3 months he recovered, and immediately hastened to London, and applied for employment. After an interval of about 4 months he was appointed to the Albemarle, of 28 guns, a French merchantman which had been purchased from the captors for the king's service. His health was not yet thoroughly re-established, and while he was employed in getting his ship ready, he again became so ill as hardly to be able to keep out of bed. Yet in this state, still suffering from the fatal effect of a West Indian climate, as if it might almost be supposed, he said, to try his constitution, he was sent to the North Seas, and kept there the whole winter. The asperity with which he mentioned this so many years afterwards evinces how deeply he resented a mode of conduct equally cruel to the individual and detrimental to the service. It was during the armed neutrality, and when they anchored off Elsinore, the Danish admiral sent on board, desiring to be informed what ships had arrived, and to have their force written down. "The Albemarle," said Nelson to the messenger, "is one of His Britannic Majesty's ships. You are at liberty, sir, to count the guns as you go down the side, and you may assure the Danish admiral that, if necessary, they shall all be well served." During this voyage he gained a considerable knowledge of the Danish coast and its soundings, greatly to the advantage of his country in after times. The Albemarle was not a good ship, and was several times nearly overset in consequence of the masts having been made much too long for her. On her return to England they were shortened, and some other improvements made at Nelson's suggestion. Still he always insisted that her first owners, the French, had taught her to run away, as she was never a good sailor except when going directly before the wind. On their return to the Downs, while he was ashore visiting the senior officer, there came on so heavy a gale that almost all the vessels drove, and a storeship came athwart hawse of the Albemarle. Nelson feared she would drive on the Goodwin Sands. He ran to the beach, but even the Deal boatmen thought it impossible to get on board, such was the violence of the storm. At length some of the most intrepid offered to make the attempt for 15 guineas, and to the astonishment and fear of all the beholders, he embarked during the height of the tempest. With great difficulty and imminent danger he succeeded in reaching her. She lost her bowsprit and foremast, but escaped further injury. He was now ordered to Quebec, where his surgeon told him he would certainly be laid up by the climate. Many of his friends urged him to represent this to Admiral Keppel, but having received his orders from Lord Sandwich, there appeared to him an indelicacy in applying to his successor to have them altered. Accordingly he sailed for Canada. During her first cruise on that station the Albemarle captured a fishing schooner which contained in her cargo nearly all the property that her master possessed, and the poor fellow had a large family at home, anxiously expecting him. Nelson employed him as a pilot in Boston Bay, then restored him the schooner and cargo, and gave him a certificate to secure him against being captured by any other vessel. The man came off afterwards to the Albemarle, at the hazard of his life, with a present of sheep, poultry, and fresh provisions. A most valuable supply it proved, for the scurvy was raging on board. This was in the middle of August, and the ship's company had not had a fresh meal since the beginning of April. The certificate was preserved at Boston in memory of an act of unusual generosity, and now that the fame of Nelson has given interest to everything connected with his name, it is regarded as a relic. The Albemarle had a narrow escape upon this cruise. 4 French sail of the line and a frigate, which had come out of Boston harbor, gave chase to her, and Nelson, perceiving that they beat him in sailing, boldly ran among the numerous shoals of St. George's Bank, confiding in his own skill in pilotage. Captain Salter, in the Sta Margareta, had escaped the French fleet by a similar maneuver not long before. The frigate alone continued warily to pursue him, but as soon as he perceived that this enemy was unsupported, he shortened sail and hove to, upon which the Frenchman thought it advisable to give over the pursuit, and sail in quest of his consorts. At Quebec, Nelson became acquainted with Alexander Davison, by whose interference he was prevented from making what would have been called an imprudent marriage. The Albemarle was about to leave the station, her captain had taken leave of his friends, and was gone down the river to the place of anchorage, when the next morning, as Davison was walking on the beach, to his surprise he saw Nelson coming back in his boat. Upon inquiring the cause of this reappearance, Nelson took his arm to walk towards the town, and told him that he found it utterly impossible to leave Quebec without again seeing the woman whose society had contributed so much to his happiness there, and offering her his hand. "If you do," said his friend, "your ruin must inevitably follow." "Then let it follow," cried Nelson, "for I am resolved to do it, and I," replied Davison, "am resolved you shall not." Nelson, however, upon this occasion, was less resolute than his friend, and suffered himself to be led back to the boat. The Albemarle was under orders to convoy a fleet of transports to New York. "A very pretty job," said her captain, "at this late season of the year. October was far advanced, for our sails are at this moment frozen to the yards." On his arrival at Sandy Hook, he waited on the commander-in-chief, Admiral Digby, who told him he was come on a fine station for making prize money. "Yes, sir," Nelson made answer, "but the West Indies is the station for honor." Lord Hood, with a detachment of Rodney's victorious fleet, was at that time at Sandy Hook. He had been intimate with Captain Suckling, and Nelson, who was desirous of nothing but honor, requested him to ask for the Albemarle, that he might go to that station where it was most likely to be obtained. Admiral Digby reluctantly parted with him. His professional merit was already well known, and Lord Hood, on introducing him to Prince William Henry, as the Duke of Clarence was then called, told the prince, if he wished to ask any questions respecting naval tactics, Captain Nelson could give him as much information as any officer in the fleet. The Duke, who, to his own honor, became from that time the firm friend of Nelson, describes him as appearing the merest boy of a captain he had ever seen, dressed in a full-laced uniform, an old-fashioned waistcoat with long flaps, and his lank unpowdered hair tied in a stiff Hessian tail of extraordinary length, making altogether so remarkable a figure, that, says the Duke, I had never seen anything like it before, nor could I imagine who he was, nor what he came about. But his address and conversation were irresistibly pleasing, and when he spoke on professional subjects, it was with an enthusiasm that showed he was no common being. It was expected that the French would attempt some of the passages between the Bahamas, and Lord Hood, thinking of this, said to Nelson, "I suppose, sir, from the length of time you were cruising among the Bahama Keys, you must be a good pilot there." He replied, with that constant readiness to render justice to every man which was so conspicuous in all his conduct through life, that he was well acquainted with them himself, but that in that respect his second lieutenant was far his superior. The French got into Puerto Cabello, on the coast of Venezuela. Nelson was cruising between that port and La Guapra, under French colors, for the purpose of obtaining information, when a king's launch, belonging to the Spaniards, passed near, and being hailed in French, came alongside without suspicion, and answered all questions that were asked concerning the number and force of the enemy's ships. The crew, however, were not a little surprised when they were taken on board and found themselves prisoners. One of the party went by the name of the Count de Duxponce. He was, however, a prince of the German Empire, and brother to the heir of the Electorate of Bavaria. His companions were French officers of distinction, and men of science, who had been collecting specimens in the various branches of natural history. Nelson, having entertained them with the best his table could afford, told them they were at liberty to depart with their boat, and all that it contained. He only required them to promise that they would consider themselves as prisoners if the commander-in-chief should refuse to acquiesce in their being thus liberated, a circumstance which was not likely to happen. Tidings soon arrived that the preliminaries of peace had been signed, and the Albemarle returned to England and was paid off. Nelson's first business, after he got to London, even before he went to see his relations, was to attempt to get the wages due to his men for the various ships in which they had served during the war. The disgust of seamen to the Navy, he said, was all owing to the infernal plan of turning them over from ship to ship, so that men could not be attached to their officers, nor the officers care the least about the men. Yet he himself was so beloved by his men that his whole ship's company offered, if he could get a ship, to enter for her immediately. He was now, for the first time, presented at court. After going through this ceremony, he dined with his friend Davison at Lincoln's Inn. As soon as he entered the chambers, he threw off what he called his iron-bound coat, and, putting himself at ease in a dressing gown, passed the remainder of the day in talking over all that had befallen them since they parted on the shore of the river St. Lawrence. That was the life of Horatio, Lord Nelson by Robert Southey. Part 1, 1758 to 1783. Which was read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Thank you very much for listening. Good night.